2. History. Listen to a lecture in a history class. Fill in the diagram with the information that you hear.
Today, I want to continue our lecture on Alexander the Great. As you already know, Alexander was a Greek military leader who conquered much of the known world in the mid-4th century BCE. An interesting thing is, aside from all the territory he conquered, Alexander the Great also contributed significantly to the spread of Greek culture. Alexander was legendary for his policy of fusion. What I mean by that is that he promoted the assimilation of foreigners in the army. I think I'm still confusing you all. Basically, he was more welcoming of people from other countries than many other rulers in history tended to be. For example, he would have his Greek generals marry noblewomen from Persia. He allowed his own culture to combine with cultures from around the world. Another way that Alexander helped spread Greek culture was by his sheer notoriety. I mean, the guy was practically a superstar, as famous in his day as some of the musicians you might listen to today. When you consider that he was undefeated in battle, it's easy to understand why he had fans around the world. One good example is the Romans. It's said that the Romans really esteemed Alexander and sought to associate themselves with him. One way we can see that is that the Romans all prided themselves on speaking Greek. In fact, it was the unofficial language of the academics.
1. What is the main topic of the lecture? Two. What aspect of Alexander's reign does the professor mainly discuss? 10. Music history. Listen to a discussion in a music history class. Fill in the diagram with the information that you hear.
What we will talk about today are bards, as understood in the Celtic tradition. There are actually a few different definitions of a bard, but we're going to focus on one.
Sorry for the interruption, but what does Celtic mean?
Oh, Celtic just refers to a culture in along Western Europe. Think Ireland, Scotland, but before and during the Middle Ages. Okay, now to define a bard. In the Celtic tradition, a bard was essentially a musician, though they had a very different role than the musicians we know today. I want to talk more about the role of the bard in a minute. But basically, what the bard did was compose and perform music, alone almost always, and the bard would play an instrument and sing. But it's what the bards sang that was really interesting. In fact, the music had more in common with our modern literature than it does with our music. Bards generally sang songs that told long, epic stories, sometimes of real events that happened, or maybe just folk stories that had been passed on from previous generations.
So a bard was like a storyteller, but with music too.
That's right. Now, I'm sure you're aware from your history classes of how important storytelling can be in the understanding of a culture's history. Regardless of whether a story is true or not, it can give insight into how a culture thought. That sort of thing. Rather than the actual events that happened. So, as I think you can see, yes?
I get that the bards are also a source of history like other storytellers. But how can history be passed on through a story if it isn't written down?
That's a good question. See, the bards were so influential to the people that they actually helped them, the people, commit these histories to memory. This is likely to show up on a quiz next week, by the way. Back to the question, the effectiveness of a bard comes in. Well, let me give you a modern example. Have you ever heard a melody that is just so catchy that you can't get it out of your head? Well, that helps you remember the words of the song too, right? That's just what the bards did. They sang songs that people could remember.
I get it. So that quality, the way songs can get stuck in our heads, actually helped pass on history because it would help people remember the stories.
1. According to the professor, which of the following defines Celtic culture? 2. According to the professor, what kinds of stories did bards tell in their songs? 3. How did music help people remember history? 2. History. Listen to a lecture in a history class. Fill in the diagram with the information that you hear.
Okay, everyone. Today we're going to be discussing the Sea Dogs, who were, well, basically they were pirates around the 1580s. They were actually English pirates, and like other pirates, they stole stuff from ships they captured. But they were actually employed by the Queen of England in secret, and their goal was to rob and steal from Spanish ships and ports. Let's get more into why they did this. First, I want to talk about why they stole gold from Spanish ships. See, Queen Elizabeth of England didn't really like King Philip of Spain. They didn't have a good political relationship, but Elizabeth wanted to make it seem like they did. So she hired these sea dogs in secret as a way to attack King Philip without officially declaring war. What I mean is, by stealing gold from Spanish ships, she was stealing gold from Spain and thus from King Philip. And the Spanish didn't know it was really Elizabeth behind it. Also, the sea dogs actually went as far as to capture land, ports mostly. One of the pirates, Sir Francis Drake, started taking land from the Spanish in the name of England. Over time, Drake became more, daring in his exploits, and eventually war broke out between England and Spain. Some would say that Drake caused the war, but not me.
1. Listen again to part of the lecture. Then answer the question.
They were actually English pirates, and like other pirates, they stole stuff from ships they captured.
Why does the professor say this?
Like other pirates, they stole stuff from ships they captured.
2. Listen again to part of the lecture. Then answer the question.
So she hired these sea dogs in secret as a way to attack King Philip without officially declaring war. What I mean is, by stealing gold from Spanish ships, she was stealing gold from Spain and thus from King Philip.
Why does the professor say this?
What I mean is,
Three. Listen again to part of the lecture. Then answer the question.
some would say that Drake caused the war, but not me.
Why does the professor say this?
But not me.
6. History. Listen to a lecture in a history class. Fill in the diagram with the information that you hear.
The Gettysburg Address is the great speech delivered by President Abraham Lincoln at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, that touched many Americans' hearts. But did you know it was only about 2 minutes in length? Amazing, huh? Okay, so first, let me give you some background info. The president made this speech during the American Civil War back in 1863. And he gave it at Gettysburg, the site of a huge battle. But here's my question. Why was the speech so effective? Simple. It touched people's emotions, and that's what I want to focus on now. Well, first of all, Lincoln evoked strong emotions by talking about the importance of human equality, and many people thought that was really what the Civil War was being fought over. In his speech, he was referring to the American Revolution, about how people made great efforts to achieve freedom, reminding the American people what they are about liberty and equality among all. Not among a select few, but among all. So he made an emotional appeal, a very strong demand that all people be equal. Next, and despite the split within America, remember the nation was divided at this time, Lincoln made sure to constantly use the word nation to emphasize that America would not remain divided, but would come together as one to devote itself to its main causes, which again were liberty and equality. This made Americans feel as if they were part of a whole again, creating a feeling of great unity. They needed to hear this, and it made people react very emotionally. Oh, and one more key point. Lincoln did not introduce any new concepts to the people. In fact, he reminded them of what they knew, which is probably why it touched them so deeply.
1. What is the professor's general attitude toward the Gettysburg Address? Two. What can be inferred about the professor when she says this?
Oh, and one more key point. Lincoln did not introduce any new concepts to the people. In fact, he reminded them of what they knew, which is probably why it touched them so deeply.
3. What is the professor's opinion of Lincoln's use of the word nation? Six. Art history. Listen to a lecture in an art history class. Fill in the diagram with the information that you hear.
I noticed that many of you still aren't sure about the differences between Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. You got the similarities: vivid colors, a thick application of paint. Let me make some further points to help you understand the distinctions. The Impressionists started off as a group of artists who just wanted to do something different than what was currently being prescribed by the Academy of Fine Arts in 19th century France. The Impressionists departed from tradition by painting contemporary scenes. Additionally, they painted open-air scenes and landscapes. This is significant because before the Impressionists, nobody painted landscapes. On the other hand, the Post-Impressionists felt like the scenes painted in Impressionist works were too trivial. They felt like, that there wasn't any emotion. So they stressed emotion in their paintings and therefore focused more on people. Should I sum up? Couldn't hurt. When you think Impressionist, think landscapes without much emotion, and with the Post-Impressionists, think human subjects and more emotion. Now, moving on, there were also some artistic methods, some techniques that differed between the two. With Impressionism, it's suggested that Claude Monet one day just decided to walk outside and start painting. He felt like it was important to capture something at that very moment, in the state it was in. So what this translates to is very quick brushstrokes and a focus on the way that the light at that time of the day affects a piece. But with the Post-Impressionists, they generally took a few different, people like Van Gogh and Seurat took more time with their brushstrokes. Van Gogh used a lot of swirling patterns, while Seurat made tiny dots of color to form a picture. And instead of being concerned with lighting, they cared more about capturing the emotion of the subject than capturing the light of a landscape.
1. How does the professor organize the information presented in the lecture? Two. Why does the professor discuss the Academy of Fine Arts? Three. Why does the professor mention artistic methods? Ten. Art history. Listen to a discussion in an art history class. Fill in the diagram with the information that you hear.
Today we're going to talk about two important art movements of the 20th century, Cubism and Surrealism. I want our focus to be on how they are constructed, rather than any sort of historical stuff. So, we'll start off by talking about how the Cubists thought of their art. Let's open up the discussion. Any thoughts? Yes.
Well, I seem to remember reading about how Cubism began. It was Picasso and Georges Braque. They thought of art in terms of little cubes.
That's true. Let me expand on that. What Cubism, Cubist art, tries to do is take apart a scene or a subject and tries to put it back together using geometric shapes, like cubes, hence the name Cubism. Is that clear?
Well, the thing I wonder is, everything is made of shapes anyway, right? So how is Cubism really different?
Good question. Putting the shapes back together really isn't all of it. The most important part of it is that the shapes have to be reassembled in an abstract way. So maybe a cube goes at the end of an arm where a hand usually would be. Therefore, it's more abstract. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and actually, can I say something about surrealism? If we're done with Cubism?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so from what I recall, surrealism had the same idea of distorting reality, right? But the surrealists did it in a different way. I remember someone saying that the best way to describe surrealism was to think of it as putting real things in a dream world.
You know, I like that idea. I'd say surrealism is very much like that. But in artistic terms, they took actual things and merged them in strange ways, rather than reassemble them in different shapes. So, like in Dolly's works, you might see clocks on a table out in the desert melting clocks and a tree growing out of the table. You wouldn't usually see those things in real life, right? At least not together. So, it's almost like being in a dream world, even just looking at the painting.
1. How does the professor organize the information about the two art movements? 2. Why does the professor mention geometric shapes? 3. Why does the student mention distorting reality? 2. History. Listen to a lecture in a history class. Fill in the diagram with the information that you hear.
A symbol, as you all know, is a thing that stands for, represents something else. A tiger, for instance, may symbolize power. An interesting thing is that the meaning of a symbol might change over time. For example, the Bastille was a prison in Paris, and yet somehow it has come to symbolize freedom. Let's talk about how that happened. First, let's focus on the original, what the Bastille used to stand for. The Bastille was a prison. This is during the rule of King Louis XVI. We're talking about the late 1700s. At that time, it was for those who acted or wrote or spoke rebelliously against the French government. It represented a place of political oppression, and the absolute monarchy that controlled France. Anyone who said anything that the government thought was rebellious was put in the Bastille. But this all changed when the people of Paris got fed up with the government and decided to free the prisoners. In what's referred to as the storming of the Bastille, an angry crowd attacked the prison and released everyone in it. This event actually triggered the French Revolution, which brought great change to France. The people were finally free of the absolute monarchy. So as you can see, the Bastille actually became a step toward France's freedom, and I think you can understand why it's now a symbol of freedom too.
6. History. Listen to a lecture in a history class. Fill in the diagram with the information that you hear.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today we'll be exploring how Confucianism has affected Northeastern Asian countries, such as China, South Korea, and Japan. Confucianism is an early collection of ethics and social and philosophical ideas that are based upon the teachings of the ancient Chinese philosopher Confucius. The basic idea of Confucianism is pretty much how each person can participate in creating a peaceful, well-organized society. Each of the nations I mentioned took Confucianism and modified it to suit its particular tastes. First of all, Confucian ideals shape the social relations of many people in northeastern Asia. For example, its influence in Japan can be seen in the way that order and relationships are understood. Confucianism stresses the importance of individual relationships, basically how people relate to each other in terms of their place in society. It's like in a family. Parents and children know their places. So everyone should know their place in society. Many Asian countries have taken this very seriously, and they enjoy a lot of social harmony because of it. Secondly, people have found ways to apply the idea of Confucian social harmony to business. Confucianism actually discourages seeking profit. Confucius said that profit led people to do wrong to other people. Well, that idea wouldn't be a good thing to apply to a business. However, the idea of harmony can really help a business run smoothly. Confucianism's ideals include an aversion to conflict. So, without conflict in the workplace, things run more smoothly. Imagine a workplace where everyone worked together in harmony. In addition, along the same lines as social relationships, if everyone knows their place in the workplace, there are no power struggles, and businesses can operate without any of those complications. If workers aren't just trying to, climb the corporate ladder, they can instead focus on sharing ideas and cooperating.
1. What does the relationship between parents and children demonstrate? 2. What does the professor demonstrate by discussing profit in business? 3. What does the professor demonstrate by discussing power struggles? 9. History. Listen to a lecture in a history class. Fill in a diagram with the information that you hear.
Continuing our discussion of the Spanish conquest in Mexico today, I want to briefly discuss an indigenous group called the Purapeca, which still exists today. By the way, who offered some of the strongest resistance against the Spanish. So I'll just start by defining the tribe for you, saying a little about them. But the main thing I want to focus on is a couple of theories that try to explain how they were able to survive as a culture. Okay, let's go. Compared to other tribes, very little is known about the history of the Purapeca. Anthropologists are still pondering their exact origins. But it's widely believed that they came from somewhere in South America. Anyway, what I want to segue into is that the territory that they inhabited is Central America, modern Mexico. This is of particular significance because of the tribe's relation to the Aztec Empire. Are you all following so far? Let me explain a little further then. Of the little bit of Purapeca history that has been reconstructed, it is known that they were involved in numerous battles with the Aztecs. In fact, it was one of the few tribes that were able to successfully resist the Aztecs. Historians believe that two factors played a big role in being able to do so. First off, unlike any other tribes in the region, the Purapeca had knowledge of metallurgy. This is one of the reasons that anthropologists think that they came from South America. Anyway, their skill for working metal gave them the capacity to create advanced weaponry. Additionally, Purapeca warriors have been described in many different accounts as having worn armor. It's assumed that the advanced weapons and body armor enabled the Purapeca to defend themselves and their lands more effectively. Next, the Purapeca apparently had a military organization that was pretty much unmatched by any other indigenous group in the region. In size, and in organization, training, and such. Let me share something I saw in my readings recently. Not surprisingly, the Aztecs attempted to invade Purapeca lands on numerous occasions. In 1478, the Aztecs led a battle against the Purapeca. However, they were badly defeated when more than 40,000 Purapeca soldiers met the Aztec forces, comprised of 24,000 soldiers.
1. What does the professor imply when she says this?
Compared to other tribes, very little is known about the history of the Puripeka.
2. What does the professor imply when she says this?
In fact, it was one of the few tribes that were able to successfully resist the Aztecs.
3. What does the professor imply when she says this?
Next, the Puripeka apparently had a military organization that was pretty much unmatched by any other indigenous group in the region.
Practice test.
In this section, you will listen to 4 lectures and 2 conversations. You will hear each lecture and conversation one time. After each listening passage, you will answer some questions about it. Most questions are worth 1 point, but some questions are worth more than 1 point. The directions indicate how many points you may receive. You will have 30 to 40 minutes to both listen and answer the questions. The questions ask about the main idea and supporting details. Some questions ask about a speaker's purpose or attitude. You may take notes while you listen. You may use your notes to help you answer the questions. Your notes will not be scored. In some questions, you will see this icon. This means you will hear part of the lecture or conversation again. When you are ready, press Continue.
Listen to a lecture in a history class.
I'm sure you all have heard of the term yellow journalism. In case you haven't, it refers to a type of journalism that focuses on sensational topics that will get people's attention. It shouldn't be such a problem, except that it's also associated with, unethical practices, and sometimes even outright lying. There are plenty of modern examples of yellow journalism, but you might be surprised to learn that it first appeared more than a century ago. In spite of all the criticism it garnered then, it actually played an important role in many historical events of the era. It brought attention to the hardships of city life for immigrants, and later it drew public attention to the Spanish-American War. You're probably wondering how this was possible. Why don't we talk a little bit about how that happened? Let me begin by saying that yellow journalism was born, in an official sense, as a marketing strategy by a young newspaperman named Joseph Pulitzer. Very simply, Pulitzer wanted to find a way to get more people to read his paper. So he tried to make his paper interesting by including games and contests. Additionally, he realized that he could increase his readership significantly by tapping into the immigrant market, which, as you can imagine, was considerable in the early 19th century. So that's what he did, and his paper sold like crazy. At this point, I want to note that although Pulitzer wanted to find a way to make more money, he also felt that it was his duty to improve society. So, although he ran sensational headlines like "Lines of Little Hearses" or, how babies are baked to catch people's attention, many of the articles were relevant to current events and society, especially to the immigrant community of New York City. Pulitzer's enterprise became quite lucrative, and it inspired another young man named William Hearst to follow in his footsteps. Hearst used many of the same techniques as Pulitzer. His paper featured attention-grabbing headlines, and its stories usually involved crime or celebrity scandals. Furthermore, at only 1 cent, his newspaper cost less than Pulitzer's. As readership grew, Hearst had to search high and low to keep finding scandalous material to draw readers. Many times, Hearst was criticized for embellishing stories, and when there was no story, Hearst was happy to stir one up. This was sort of the case with the Spanish-American War. See, prior to the outbreak of the war, Hearst supposedly told one of his reporters that he would furnish a war for him to cover. And when the war finally did break out in 1895, it was on the front page nearly every day. Political cartoons depicted the Spanish as brutal and cruel. The articles were not always accurate, that is, until Hearst himself traveled to Cuba to cover the events. Interestingly, although historians all pretty much agree that Hearst played a very minor role, if any, in starting the war, many say that his coverage later in the war helped promote awareness about the realities that the Cubans faced under Spanish rule.
1. What is the main topic of the lecture? 2. Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
In case you haven't, it refers to a type of journalism that focuses on sensational topics that will get people's attention. It shouldn't be such a problem, except that it's also associated with, unethical practices, and sometimes even outright lying. There are plenty of modern examples of yellow journalism, but you might be surprised to learn that it first appeared more than a century ago.
What does the professor imply when she says this?
There are plenty of modern examples of yellow journalism, but you might be surprised to learn that it first appeared more than a century ago.
3. According to the professor, why did Pulitzer target the immigrant community? 4. What does the professor imply when she says this?
Very simply, Pulitzer wanted to find a way to get more people to read his paper.
5. What is the professor's attitude toward Hearst's role in the Spanish-American War? 6. How does the professor organize the information about yellow journalism that she presents to the class?